For over 4 decades, the world lived under the threat of total destruction, while two superpowers, the United States and Soviet Union, competed by global influence, spied on mutually and accumulated arsenals capable of annihilating humanity, leaving all other countries in constant fear of a devastating nuclear war. To understand this story, we need to go back a few decades in the past. In late 1943, U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt returned to Washington visibly exhausted, carrying the signs of a fragile body and a mind overloaded by the years of leadership during one of the worst wars in history, World War II. The weight of daily decisions, combined with the effects of their polio, limited their mobility and energy. He already showed clear signs of serious illnesses, such as uncontrolled hypertension and advanced heart problems that were aggravated by his sedentary lifestyle, as well as frequent cigarette and alcohol consumption. Roosevelt recognized the severity of his condition and even confided to the Chief of Staff, William Leahy, that he did not know if he would have the strength to continue. Nevertheless, the idea of abandoning power and becoming a secondary figure in the post-war world's reconstruction process terrified it. Moved by this fear, Roosevelt decided to run for re-election in 1944, a controversial decision that many historians consider a selfish act, as he knew that his weakened health made it unlikely to complete a 4th term. Even so, he preferred to keep control and decided to move on, carrying the weight of war and world politics on his shoulders until his last days. In 1944, Franklin D. Roosevelt faced the difficult task of choosing a new plate companion for the presidential election, replacing then President Henry Wallace. Wallace was seen as a progressive politician, but his posture openly on the left made him a polarizing figure, especially among the most moderate and conservative Democrats of the party. Concerned about Wallace's possibility to harm re-election, Roosevelt chose to replace him with Harry Truman, a Missouri senator who had a reputation for pragmatism and popular appeal. Truman was moderate, simple speech, and well-related to Midwest and Southern political sectors, regions that were more resistant to Wallace's progressive policies. In addition, his popular image contrasted with Roosevelt's aristocratic figure, creating a balance on the plate. Truman's selection was largely strategic, but also revealed a controversial political decision by Roosevelt. He chose a candidate with little experience in international politics and, perhaps more troubling, failed to dedicate time to prepare him as a potential successor. Truman was kept on the sidelines of major debates and decisions during the campaign, and even after his election as vice president. Between November 1944 and Roosevelt's death in April 1945, the two had very few meetings, with only one held in private. The president avoided involving him in crucial discussions, such as the Yalta Conference, leaving him unprepared to take on leadership in an emergency. This sharply contrasts with the weight of the responsibilities Truman would inherit just months later. Although politically advantageous, Roosevelt's decision reflected a self-centered perspective, as he believed he was irreplaceable in leading the United States during the war. Roosevelt trusted that his experience and charisma were unmatched and that he, and only he, could steer the nation and the world through such a critical moment. However, this confidence created a leadership vacuum that became evident after his death. Truman's inexperience in international affairs made his transition to the presidency a monumental challenge, especially in a rapidly shifting global landscape. The impact of this decision would shape American policies in the post-war period, influencing the dynamics among the Allies and contributing to the tensions that gave rise to an event that would divide humanity for decades, the infamous Cold War. While Franklin D. Roosevelt displayed exceptional leadership skills in guiding the United States through World War II, his vision for the post-war world was notably vague and imprecise. He often impressed allies and advisors with broad, idealistic concepts like the idea of the four policemen, the United States, the Soviet Union, Britain, and China, which, in his view, would maintain world order and ensure peace. Another central pillar of his strategy was the creation of the United Nations, which he envisioned as an organization capable of preventing future global conflicts. However, beyond these general ideas, Roosevelt avoided delving into concrete issues such as the military occupation of Europe, the reconstruction of Germany, and the balance of power with the Soviet Union. This ambiguous approach stood in stark contrast to the stance of his allies. Stalin, for instance, had a clear and pragmatic vision for the future, securing the Soviet Union's safety through direct control over Eastern Europe. Churchill, on the other hand, sought to preserve Britain's status as a global power by protecting the British Empire. While Stalin and Churchill outlined concrete strategic goals, Roosevelt seemed reluctant to make definitive decisions on fundamental issues, leaving many of his plans open to interpretation. This created challenges not only for his allies, but also for his own advisors, who often found themselves without clear directives for negotiations or policy implementation. A striking example of this lack of clarity was his stance on Germany. Although he agreed to the initial division of the country into occupation zones, Roosevelt avoided discussing long-term plans for governing or rebuilding Germany. The issue of Poland, another source of tension among the Allies, was also marked by his hesitation. While Stalin was determined to consolidate Soviet control over the country, Roosevelt limited himself to proposing intermediate solutions, such as a provisional government with multiple parties. This lack of planning wasn't limited to Europe. In the Pacific and Asia, Roosevelt also avoided taking firm positions on Japan's reconstruction, the future of China, and the reconfiguration of European colonies, such as those of France and the Netherlands. This uncertainty paved the way for disagreements that would shape the geopolitical landscape of the post-war era. Without clear answers to the most difficult questions, Roosevelt trusted that cooperation among the great powers would be enough to overcome these challenges. In October 1944, during a meeting in Moscow, Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin reached an understanding known as the Percentages Agreement, which highlighted the pragmatic disposition of the two leaders to divide Europe into spheres of influence. This symbolic moment revealed the differences between their approaches and that of Franklin D. Roosevelt. While Stalin and Churchill negotiated directly, exchanging ideas openly and without illusions about the balance of power, Roosevelt was absent, remaining detached from agreements that defined the course of European affairs. The agreement, made almost informally, involved a straightforward division of influence over Eastern European countries in percentages. For instance, Greece would be 90% under British influence, while Romania would have 90% Soviet influence, with other nations split in similar proportions. Though it was not an official treaty, this understanding reflected the practical approach of Churchill and Stalin, who recognized the need to avoid direct conflicts and ensure stability within their respective zones of interest. For Churchill, the goal was to maintain Britain's relevance in post-war Europe, while Stalin saw the expansion of Soviet influence as vital to his country's security. This episode also highlighted the growing distrust among the Allies, despite their apparent unity. While Churchill and Stalin were pragmatic about their ambitions, Roosevelt often underestimated their determination to secure their national interests. Furthermore, the agreement underscored Roosevelt's isolation from these critical negotiations, which later hindered his ability to mediate disputes during the Yalta Conference. While Roosevelt continued to envision a world order based on cooperation and equality among the great powers, the Percentages Agreement showed that, in practice, Stalin and Churchill were already shaping Europe's future based on their own strategic priorities. This division foreshadowed many of the conflicts that would define the Cold War, as it established precedents for Soviet control over Eastern Europe and the limitations of Western influence in the region. Held in February 1945 in Crimea, the Yalta Conference brought together Franklin D. Roosevelt, Joseph Stalin, and Winston Churchill to discuss the post-war world. Roosevelt arrived weakened, visibly affected by illness, while Stalin, emboldened by military victories, was at the height of his influence. Churchill, meanwhile, fought to preserve Britain's role as a major power amid the growing dominance of the United States and the Soviet Union. The main topics of discussion included the division of Germany into occupation zones, the future of Poland, and the Soviet Union's entry into the war against Japan. Roosevelt sought to solidify the creation of the United Nations, his top priority, while Stalin focused on securing Soviet control over Eastern Europe, especially Poland, which he viewed as essential to the USSR security. Although initial agreements were made amicably, many decisions were left ambiguous, particularly regarding Poland's political future and the continued presence of Allied troops in Europe. The conference exposed the differences among the leaders, with Stalin leveraging his military advantage to assert his interests and Roosevelt attempting to balance pragmatism with idealism. However, Roosevelt's declining health and reluctance to confront Stalin directly limited his effectiveness. Yalta produced compromises that seemed promising at the time, but quickly became sources of conflict and controversy as tensions among the Allies grew. Poland was the most contentious issue at the Yalta Conference, exposing deep divisions among the Allies. While Stalin insisted on maintaining control over Poland, Roosevelt and Churchill sought to ensure a democratic government that reflected the ideals the Allies claimed to be fighting for. Stalin had already established the Lublin Committee, a pro-Soviet provisional government, and rejected any involvement from the Polish government in exile. Based in London, Roosevelt tried to mediate by proposing an interim multi-party government that balanced the different factions, but Stalin remained inflexible. For him, Poland was not just a strategic territory, but also a symbol of Soviet power in Eastern Europe. The Soviet position was clear. Wherever the Red Army was present, Moscow's influence would prevail. Churchill, though eloquent in his defense of an independent Poland, avoided directly confronting Stalin, fearing it might jeopardize the alliance. The deadlock highlighted the disparity of priorities among the leaders. Roosevelt sought to avoid a rupture with Stalin, believing that Allied cooperation was essential for world peace. However, his conciliatory approach ultimately allowed Stalin to shape Poland's future to favor the Soviet Union. In the end, a vague agreement was reached, promising free elections but effectively ensuring Soviet domination. After the Yalta Conference, Joseph Stalin solidified his position as the war's master strategist, but his attitude shifted rapidly. He abandoned any semblance of cooperation with the Allies and began asserting his influence over Eastern Europe. Soviet domination was enforced by the Red Army, which controlled the occupied territories, and Stalin used this leverage to install pro-Soviet governments, disregarding Yalta commitments to hold free elections, particularly in Poland. Simultaneously, Stalin displayed growing distrust toward the United States and Britain. He rejected American attempts to send observers to Poland and accused Roosevelt of absurd conspiracies, such as negotiating a secret deal with Hitler. This paranoid behavior marked the return of the old Stalin, who, with victory secured, felt emboldened to abandon the pragmatism that had guided his wartime actions. Tensions among the Allies began to escalate as Stalin demonstrated his disregard for Western priorities. He prioritized expanding Soviet borders and consolidating a bloc of satellite nations in Eastern Europe. For Western leaders, Stalin's actions revealed that he saw the Yalta commitments as mere diplomatic formalities, not a genuine foundation for cooperation. These actions deepened divisions among the Allies and set the stage for the Cold War. Stalin's initial pragmatism, which had earned him great gains, gave way to an authoritarian approach that alienated the United States and Britain, while Roosevelt, in the final months of his life, grew increasingly skeptical of Soviet intentions. The groundwork was being laid for a new global order, defined by clear ideological confrontations. The death of Franklin D. Roosevelt on April 12, 1945, marked a pivotal moment for the United States and world geopolitics. The president passed away at his residence in Warm Springs, Georgia, after suffering a massive stroke, leaving the country in the hands of Harry Truman, an inexperienced vice president who knew little about Roosevelt's complex negotiations and post-war intentions. The resulting leadership vacuum had profound consequences, especially since Truman was unprepared to handle Stalin or implement Roosevelt's vision of international cooperation. Roosevelt believed that world peace depended on cooperation between the United States and the Soviet Union. He hoped the alliance with Stalin could endure even after World War II. However, his premature death and Truman's ascension to the presidency drastically changed the course of that relationship. Suspicious of Stalin's intentions, Truman adopted a more confrontational approach, helping pave the way for the Cold War. Roosevelt's legacy was marked by uncertainties. Many of his ideas and plans for the post-war period were poorly documented or communicated, leaving Truman and other American leaders without clear guidelines for handling Europe's reconstruction and Soviet expansion. The lack of clarity around the Yalta agreements and Roosevelt's long-term objectives forced Truman to make quick and improvised decisions during a time of massive geopolitical upheaval, as the world struggled to recover from the horrors of war. Meanwhile, Stalin took advantage of the new dynamic to consolidate control over Eastern Europe. The rapid leadership change in the United States not only weakened relations among the former allies, but also intensified the ideological division that would dominate the global stage for decades to come. Roosevelt's idealism gave way to a strategic pragmatism that marked the beginning of an era defined by distrust and rivalry, the Cold War. The Cold War was not just a clash between capitalism and communism. It was an era of constant tension that shaped the world, with the United States and the Soviet Union leading opposing blocs. The Cold War became the backdrop for a fierce technological and scientific rivalry epitomized by the space race. Both nations competed to demonstrate their superiority, culminating in the historic achievement of 1969, when the Americans landed a man on the moon with the Apollo 11 mission. This rivalry extended beyond prestige. Technological and military advancements served as displays of power, fueling the arms race and fears of nuclear war, as seen during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. Beyond technological and military tensions, the Cold War influenced the entire world, with the superpowers vying for influence in Asia, Africa, and Latin America through proxy wars, such as those in Korea and Vietnam. It also shaped everyday life, with propaganda, culture, and even political repression reflecting the intense ideological rivalry. This period redefined global politics and left a cultural and psychological legacy that still resonates in modern geopolitics. Even without direct conflict between the superpowers, the consequences of this ideological clash affected nations worldwide, created deep divisions, and established alliances that continue to influence geopolitics to this day.